Have you ever heard of the Texas Massacre? Well, let me tell you about a small town that no one ever talks about, at least not openly. The place is called Mill Creek, and it's tucked away somewhere in the deep heart of Texas, surrounded by miles and miles of dusty roads and thick woods. It's the kind of town where people mind their own business and keep to themselves. But beneath the surface, there's a darkness that no one dares mention. A place so quiet that you could almost hear the wind whispering its secrets through the branches of the towering oak trees. But those secrets, they're far from innocent. Mill Creek is the kind of town that feels like it's stuck in another time. You know, the kind of place where everyone knows each other by name, but still manages to keep a safe distance. In a town like this, gossip travels faster than the wind. But there's one thing that people never talk about. No matter how much you ask. And that thing has haunted Mill Creek for decades. Years ago, something horrible happened here. A group of strangers, each one a traveler passing through, were found brutally murdered in the woods on the outskirts of town. The scene was so gruesome, so horrifying, that it felt like something straight out of a nightmare. The blood-soaked earth and the twisted bodies left behind told a story that no one wanted to hear. The killings were so savage, it felt as though a wild beast had taken the lives of these innocent people. The authorities were called, of course, but no one could explain who did it or why. The killers were never caught. The investigation stalled, and after months of dead ends, the townspeople started moving on. But the horror never truly left. As the years went by, the killings became part of Mill Creek's history, like a shadow lingering just beyond the horizon. It became the kind of thing that no one would speak of during the day. But at night, when the wind howled through the empty streets, the whispers began. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a curse. The kind of curse that clung to the town like a second skin, unshakable and suffocating. The murders became nothing more than a rumor, but the chilling truth remained hidden in the woods, just waiting for someone to dig it up. Jake, a young reporter fresh out of college, had heard the stories. He had heard about the murders, about the curse, and the people who swore that the killer still roamed the woods at night. But Jake was skeptical. He was a city boy, used to fast-paced stories about politics, crime, and drama. Stories that made the front pages of big newspapers. So when he was sent on an assignment to Mill Creek, he figured it was just another small-town feature that would bore his readers to sleep. He didn't expect much, just a few interviews with the locals and maybe a picture or two of the town square. But as soon as he drove into Mill Creek, he felt a strange sensation. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched, but can't figure out who's watching you. The town was small, almost too small, but there was something about it that made Jake uneasy. It wasn't the lack of people on the streets or the old, crumbling buildings. It was the air. It was thick, heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake didn't waste much time. He parked his car near the town's only diner, a place called Edna's, and stepped out into the heat. The air felt different here, dry and thick, as if it could swallow you whole if you stood still for too long. Inside the diner, the smells of fried food and coffee hit him like a wave. A few locals sat at the counter, their conversations low and almost reverent. They looked up as Jake walked in, but quickly turned back to their meals, as though he wasn't worth the attention. Jake wasn't sure if it was the strange atmosphere or just their natural reserve, but he immediately felt like an outsider. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tired face and dark circles under her eyes, greeted him with a faint smile. "You are not from around here," she said, her voice thick with the accent of the South. "No, just passing through," Jake replied, his eyes scanning the room for anyone who might be able to give him a lead on the story. "You'll want to be careful around these parts," the waitress said, her gaze darting to the back of the diner, where an old woman sat by herself at a corner booth. "Some things here ain't for the curious." Jake followed her gaze and noticed the woman in the corner. She was hunched over, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. Her white hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her face, though wrinkled, carried an air of quiet wisdom. She looked like she had seen the world, like she knew things others didn't. "Who's she?" Jake asked, intrigued. "That's Clara," the waitress said in a whisper. "She's lived here longer than anyone else. She's seen things, done things. Best not to ask her too many questions. She doesn't like to talk about the past." But Jake, as young and eager as he was, couldn't resist the pull of mystery. He finished his meal quickly, paid his bill, and walked over to Clara's booth. He sat down without waiting for an invitation, his notebook already in hand. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Jake asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. Clara looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see through him. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Instead, she just stared, her gaze unwavering, as though sizing him up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "People like you come here thinking they can fix things," she said in a low, gravelly voice. "But you don't understand. Some things are better left untouched." Jake's curiosity deepened. "I'm just trying to write a story. I've heard about the Texas Massacre, the murders that happened years ago. Is it true?" Clara's face hardened. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her coffee mug down. "True? You think what happened here is just some story?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "It's not a story, boy. It's a curse, and you do well to leave it alone." Jake leaned forward, his heart racing. This was the lead he had been waiting for. "What do you mean, a curse?" Clara's eyes flickered to the door, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, in a voice so quiet that Jake had to strain to hear, she said, "The Phantom. The killer. The one who was never caught. He's still here, still watching. Jake's skepticism wavered. He had heard rumors, of course, but hearing Clara say it so seriously sent a chill down his spine. "You think the killer is still alive?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara didn't answer right away. She took a deep breath, as if weighing the decision to continue. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "No, boy, the killer's not alive, but his spirit, his curse, it's still here. And anyone who digs too deep, well, they're next." Jake felt a cold shiver run through him. This wasn't just a story. This was something real, something that had haunted this town for years. And now, he was getting too close. Clara's eyes locked onto his. "Leave Mill Creek before it's too late," she warned him. "Some things are better left alone. The past has a way of coming back, and it will never let go." Jake didn't know if he believed her, but something inside him told him that he had just stumbled into something much bigger than he could handle. But there was no turning back now. The story was calling to him, and he was too deep in to walk away. And so, the darkness of Mill Creek began to unravel, piece by piece, as Jake's investigation took a turn into the unknown. What he didn't know was that some secrets were never meant to be discovered, and the past had a way of haunting those who dared to uncover it. Clara had lived in Mill Creek her entire life, and as she spoke, it became clear that the weight of her words carried the kind of wisdom that only came from experiencing something truly dark. She had heard the stories since she was a little girl, stories that most people dismissed as local folklore or exaggerated tales meant to frighten children and keep them out of the woods. But Clara's eyes, those sharp, weathered eyes that had seen so much, told a different story. According to Clara, there was a man, or at least something that appeared to be a man, who walked the woods of Mill Creek at night. The townspeople called him the Phantom, but Clara was quick to make a distinction. She explained that calling him a man was a mistake. He wasn't just a person, she said. He was something far more sinister, a creature who existed in the shadows, feeding off fear and death. People believed that the Phantom had been responsible for the brutal killings years ago, the ones Jake had heard about when he first arrived in Mill Creek. But Clara's version of the story was far more unsettling than the ones the locals liked to tell. He used to kill at random, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But he wasn't just killing people. He was feeding on fear, on the terror of the ones he took. That's how he grew stronger, and how he kept coming back. Jake listened carefully, but deep down, he couldn't quite bring himself to believe her. He had been trained as a journalist, trained to look for logic, for facts, for something he could prove with evidence. But Clara's words didn't come with any evidence. They were just stories. Stories that had been passed down through generations. Sure, they were terrifying stories, but Jake had heard hundreds of stories like them before. He didn't see anything special about this one. But something about the way Clara spoke, something about the way she looked at him, made Jake feel uneasy. It wasn't just the tone of her voice or the trembling in her hands as she gripped the edge of her coffee cup. It was the way she seemed to know things about the phantom. The killings stopped for a while, Clara continued, her voice growing even quieter. People thought it was over. The town breathed easy for years. But the phantom doesn't die, Jake. He never dies. His spirit, if that's what you can call it, is still out there, still waiting, watching. And one day, when the time is right, he will strike again. Jake tried to dismiss it. He tried to tell himself that it was just an old woman's ramblings, that the people of Mill Creek were just stuck in the past, too afraid to move on. But as Clara spoke, a chill crept up his spine, and the air around him seemed to grow colder, thicker, heavier. It was as if something unseen was pressing in on him, a presence that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. His skepticism began to waver. "He's not just a man," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible now. "He's something much worse." Jake looked at Clara, studying her face, trying to decipher whether she was just an old woman lost in the memories of a bygone era, or if there was something more to her words. Was she simply afraid, trapped in her own version of reality, or was there truth in what she was saying? His mind raced, torn between the urge to dismiss her as a victim of her own fears and the nagging suspicion that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't lying. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice rough. "What could be worse than a man, Clara? What are you saying?" Clara's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire world had gone silent. She leaned forward, her face just inches from his, her breath warm against his cheek. "He's not a man, Jake. He's a spirit. A thing that's been trapped here for years, and it's waiting for someone like you. Someone who's curious enough to ask the right questions. And once he's got you, you won't be able to escape. You won't even know what's happening until it's too late." Jake recoiled slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. Clara's words had an effect on him that he hadn't expected. There was no logical explanation for what she was saying. No reason why her wild theory should have shaken him so deeply. But it had. And now, the air in the diner felt colder, almost suffocating. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He stood up abruptly, wanting to put distance between himself and Clara. But the old woman's gaze followed him, unwavering. As he turned to leave, she called after him, her voice low but urgent. "Don't go into the woods at night, Jake. You'll find out what I mean soon enough." Jake didn't know what to think. He felt as if he had been dragged into something much darker, than he had anticipated. His curiosity, which had once driven him to pursue this story with the enthusiasm of a young reporter eager to make a name for himself, now felt like a curse. Every step he took in Mill Creek felt like he was sinking deeper into something he didn't understand. The shadows seemed to lengthen as he walked, and the buildings of the town looked darker, more imposing. The phantom, as Clara had called him, wasn't just a story anymore. It was something alive, something waiting. Jake could feel it now, like a heavy weight on his chest. And even though he had been skeptical, even though he had been convinced that this was just an old woman's superstition, he couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's warning wasn't just about the past. It was a warning about the present. That night, as Jake sat in his small motel room, trying to process everything Clara had told him, he couldn't help but feel a pull toward the woods. He knew it was foolish. He knew he should stay away. But the stories, the mystery, the unknown, something about it all called to him deep down. And despite the chill that ran down his spine, Jake couldn't help himself. He decided that the next day he would take a walk in the woods. He had to know if there was any truth to Clara's story. But little did Jake know, the phantom was already watching him. He had been watching for a long time, and Jake's curiosity had just sealed his fate. As the night drew on and the shadows grew longer, the town of Mill Creek held its breath, waiting. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right in Mill Creek. From the moment he arrived, there had been an eerie undercurrent to everything. The town was quiet, too quiet, and as the days passed, he began to feel the weight of the unspoken secrets that hung in the air. He spent the next few days trying to talk to the locals, hoping to piece together the story of the infamous murders that had occurred here. But every time he brought up the killings, the townspeople's faces would harden, their eyes darting away. They were friendly enough at first, offering smiles and pleasantries, but as soon as the conversation steered toward the past, a palpable tension filled the air. One elderly man at the local convenience store had nearly dropped the cans he was stacking when Jake mentioned the murders. His hands trembled, and he quickly excused himself, muttering something about needing to finish his work. Another woman, who Jake had hoped would provide some insight, became visibly uncomfortable and changed the topic to the weather almost immediately. It was as if talking about the past was forbidden, a taboo that no one dared to touch. It was clear to Jake now that the townspeople weren't just avoiding the subject, they were actively hiding something. They didn't want to talk about the murders, but there was a deeper, more unsettling reason for it. They were afraid. Of what? He couldn't yet say, but something in their eyes told him that whatever happened in Mill Creek all those years ago was far from over. At evening, Jake decided to take a walk to clear his mind. It had been a long, frustrating day of dead ends and unanswered questions. As he walked along the quiet streets, The town seemed almost frozen in time. The houses were old, the sidewalks cracked, and the streetlights buzzed with a low hum, casting long, distorted shadows across the road. There was no one else around, just the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jake turned onto the narrow path that led toward the woods. He had passed by the dense thicket a few times already, but tonight there was something different about it, something that called to him. The woods felt alive, as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets to each other. He had heard Clara's warnings echoing in his mind. Don't go into the woods at night. But he couldn't resist. He had to know more. As he walked deeper into the darkness, he began to hear it. At first, it was faint, a barely audible murmur that could have easily been mistaken for the wind. He stopped in his tracks, straining to listen. But there it was again, something, a whisper, soft at first, then louder, more distinct. It was almost like a voice, calling to him from the woods. Jake froze. He thought he was imagining it, but the sound grew clearer, more persistent. His name, over and over again, as if someone was standing just out of sight, beckoning him. Jake, it whispered. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, as he turned in every direction, but there was no one in sight. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was calling his name from the woods. His heart began to race, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. Maybe it was one of the locals playing a prank, but the voice didn't sound human. It was unnatural, like the sound was coming from somewhere deep within the earth itself. Jake stepped back, trying to shake off the unease creeping up on him. He turned to leave, but then something changed. His feet felt heavy, like the ground itself was holding him in place. It was as if the earth beneath him had suddenly become thick and sticky, weighing him down. His legs moved sluggishly, like he was wading through water. Panic gripped him, and he tried to move faster, but it was no use. He couldn't escape. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a shadow. At first, it was just a dark shape among the trees, blending in with the night. But as Jake's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw the figure more clearly. It was standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching him. Jake's pulse quickened. The air grew colder, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. His feet were stuck to the ground, frozen in place. The figure in the woods seemed to shift, and suddenly it started moving toward him. The figure was tall, too tall to be human. It was draped in shadows, with no clear features, just a dark, looming presence that seemed to distort the very air around it. And as it came closer, Jake could make out the face. It was pale, deathly pale. And as it stepped into the faint light of the moon, Jake could see that its eyes were hollow, black as coal, and empty. The darkness in those eyes was infinite, as though they had swallowed all the light in the world and left nothing behind. A chill ran through Jake's entire body, and for the first time, he felt a raw, primal fear take hold of him. The figure raised a hand, long and thin, and pointed directly at Jake. Jake's mouth went dry. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. It was as though time itself had stopped. The figure's fingers were elongated, almost skeletal, and they pointed at him with an eerie, deliberate slowness. It was as if it was trying to communicate with him, but Jake couldn't understand. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where you were powerless to do anything but watch as the terror unfolded around you. The figure took another step toward him, and Jake finally snapped out of his frozen state. Adrenaline surged through him, and he tried to run, to escape. But his legs were still heavy, as if they were weighed down by invisible chains. He struggled, his heart pounding in his chest, but the figure was closer now, and Jake could feel the oppressive weight of its presence closing in on him. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment, it was standing there, its hollow eyes locked onto Jake's, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the woods. Jake stood there for a moment, his breath ragged, his body trembling. He couldn't process what had just happened. He had seen it with his own eyes, that thing. But there was no explanation for it, no logical reason for what he had just experienced. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But it was impossible. He had to get out of there. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Jake willed his feet to move. He turned and ran, his heart pounding so loudly that he could hear it in his ears. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows closing in on him, mocking his escape. When Jake finally reached his motel room, he slammed the door behind him and locked it. He stood there for a moment, his back pressed against the door, trying to catch his breath. His mind was reeling, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Had it been real? Had he truly seen what he thought he had seen? Or was it just his mind playing tricks on him, overwhelmed by the stories and warnings he had been hearing? But deep down, he knew the answer. What he had seen in the woods wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. And whatever it was, it had just made its presence known to him. Jake sank to the floor, his back against the door, and tried to steady his breathing. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. The phantom, the thing in the woods, was real. And it wasn't finished with Mill Creek. And now it wasn't finished with Jake either. The terror had just begun. The next morning, Jake woke up with a sense of unease gnawing at him. His dreams had been filled with dark figures and whispers, the same haunting presence from the woods that had nearly paralyzed him the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with him. But he knew he had to keep going. He couldn't just let the fear take over. He was a reporter, and there was a story here. one that needed to be told. He remembered Clara's words from the night before about the old church at the edge of town. She had mentioned the strange markings on the walls, symbols that had been there since the massacre. According to her, these symbols were linked to an old cult that had supposedly been active around the time of the murders. At first, Jake had thought she was just indulging in superstition. But now, after everything he had experienced in Mill Creek, he wasn't so sure. With a sense of determination, Jake grabbed his camera and notebook and set out toward the church. It wasn't far from his motel, a short walk down a narrow road that wound its way out of town. As he approached, the church came into view, and the air around him seemed to grow heavier, as though the building itself was alive with secrets. The church was old, much older than anything else in Mill Creek. Its stone walls weathered by time and the elements. The windows were cracked, and the door, which had clearly not been opened in years, hung crookedly on its hinges. Jake hesitated for a moment, standing in front of the church, feeling the weight of its silence. There was something undeniably eerie about the place. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, that familiar sense of dread creeping up on him again. But he couldn't turn back now. He had to see it for himself. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air inside was thick and musty, carrying the scent of mildew and decayed wood. The light filtering through the broken windows cast long shadows across the room, making everything appear distorted and unwelcoming. The pews, once polished and well-kept, were now rotting, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he stepped forward, and the sound echoed in the vast, empty space. It was as though the church had been abandoned for decades, a place left to rot and forgotten by time. Jake's eyes scanned the room, taking in the faded grandeur of the church, and then he saw them. The symbols. They were carved into the stone walls, their shapes faded by years of neglect, but still unmistakably clear. They were not the kind of symbols you'd find in a typical church. These were intricate, alien-looking designs, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to twist and writhe as if they were alive. Some were small, barely noticeable, while others stretched across entire walls. Jake stepped closer to one of them, his breath catching in his throat. These symbols were exactly what Clara had described, the same ones she had warned him about. His mind raced. He had expected to find something old, maybe a few remnants of the past. But this was different. These symbols weren't just relics of a bygone era. They were part of something much darker. As Jake studied them, he felt a shiver run down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but something about the symbols seemed wrong, as if they were meant to be hidden, to remain forgotten. He snapped a few photos, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. He needed evidence, something concrete to show people. But as he moved around the room, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. Jake pulled it out, expecting another message from his editor or a call from someone back home. But instead, it was a message from Clara. His heart skipped a beat as he read the short, cryptic text. "He's watching you." Jake's stomach twisted into a knot. His first instinct was to brush it off, to tell himself it was just Clara's way of warning him, of trying to make him leave. But deep down, he knew she wasn't just talking about the past anymore. He could feel it. The presence, the weight of something watching him from the shadows. He tried to shake it off, to focus on the symbols, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Before he could react to the message, the ground beneath him trembled. It wasn't a simple vibration. It felt like the entire building was shifting, like something deep within the earth had stirred. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. A loud crack echoed through the church, and Jake's head snapped toward the sound. The air around him grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, darker. And then he saw it. Out of the shadows, something moved. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. The figure emerged slowly, its shape distorted by the darkness. But there was no mistaking it. The phantom. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and he stumbled back, almost falling to the ground. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure didn't move toward him, not at first. It simply stood there, watching him, its hollow eyes locked onto his. Jake couldn't tear his gaze away. There was something almost hypnotic about those eyes, something that made him feel like he was losing control, like he was being pulled into the very depths of the darkness that stood before him. The figure was tall, far taller than any man Jake had ever seen, and it was draped in shadows that clung to it like a second skin. Its face, if you could even call it that, was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes were empty, hollow. They seemed to absorb the light around them, as if the figure itself was a void, a black hole that had swallowed everything in its path. Jake could barely breathe. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The phantom's hand raised, its fingers long and spindly, pointing directly at Jake. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if the figure was trying to communicate something that Jake couldn't understand. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen. But his body refused to obey. His feet were glued to the floor, his muscles stiff, and he could only watch in terror as the phantom took a step forward. The temperature in the room dropped even further. Jake could see his breath misting in the air, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had to move, had to escape, but his body wouldn't respond. The phantom took another step. Its presence growing larger, more overwhelming. Jake could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides, like the figure was consuming the very air around him. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, the phantom spoke. The sound was more like a growl, a whisper that seemed to come from within his own mind. "You should have left when you had the chance." Jake's blood ran cold. The words were not just a threat. They were a warning. A warning that he had crossed a line, that he had dug too deep into the past. And now, there would be no escape. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jake finally managed to move. He turned on his heel and ran, his feet pounding against the creaking floorboards as he fled from the church. The darkness seemed to chase him, the air thick with the weight of the phantom's presence. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left him. When he finally burst out into the daylight, gasping for air, the church loomed behind him, dark and foreboding. The phantom had vanished, but Jake knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. He stood there, panting, trying to gather his thoughts, but they were scattered, torn apart by the horror of what he had just witnessed. The symbols, the phantom, the warning, it all pointed to one thing. Mill Creek wasn't just haunted by the past. It was being consumed by it. And Jake was in the center of it. There was no going back now. He was part of the story, whether he liked it or not. Jake's heart was a drumbeat in his chest, pounding so loudly he could feel it in his throat, his ears, his whole body. His breath was shallow and frantic as he sprinted through the church, the overwhelming presence of the phantom closing in behind him. Each footstep echoed off the walls, louder and louder, closer and closer, like the thing was right on his heels. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to lose any time. The fear, raw and primal, surged through him, spurring him on. The air in the church felt suffocating, like he was running through thick molasses. But his legs were heavy, refusing to move fast enough. The terror gnawed at him, and he pushed himself harder, his body threatening to collapse from exhaustion. He had to get out. He had to escape. The thought burned in his mind with a single, desperate clarity. Mill Creek wasn't just a town. It was a prison built on fear, on something ancient, something unspeakable. And if he didn't leave now, he might never leave at all. Jake's gaze darted around the room as he ran, looking for an escape. But there was nothing. No windows, no doors, only walls of decaying wood and stone. The church, once a place of peace, now felt like a mausoleum, an empty, forsaken place where something malevolent had taken root. Then, as if by instinct, Jake's eyes caught sight of something on the floor, a faint outline beneath the dust. His breath hitched. a trapdoor. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he lunged toward it, yanking the old, rusted handle. The door creaked loudly, a horrible sound that sent a shiver down his spine, but it opened. He didn't care that the floor was dark and smelled of rot. He didn't care that he had no idea what lay beneath. All he could think about was escaping the thing that was chasing him. Jake descended into the darkness below the church. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and something fouler, older. The smell made him gag, but he kept moving, deeper into the underground tunnel. The floor was uneven, covered in dust and old wood, and he had to keep his balance as the darkness pressed in around him. The tunnel felt like it went on forever, a labyrinth of cold stone and crumbling earth. The walls were covered in moss, the faint trickle of water running somewhere beneath him. But Jake wasn't paying attention to that. All he could hear was the sound of his breath, ragged and desperate, the echoes of his footsteps in the silence. The further he went, the more distant the world above seemed, like it was fading away, slipping into nothingness. He couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. He had no idea where he was going, but the thought of going back to the church, back to the phantom, was unthinkable. His mind raced with thoughts of the people of Mill Creek. He had to warn them. He had to tell them what was coming. But the thought of them all facing the same horror he had witnessed paralyzed him with fear, trapped. Jake stumbled over a loose stone in the tunnel, the sound of his fall echoing through the narrow space. He pushed himself back up, wiping the dust from his hands, and kept going. His muscles burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when he was so close. As the tunnel stretched on, the temperature began to drop. Jake could see his breath now, thick and white in the air, like fog swirling around him. The further he went, the colder it became, and the walls seemed to close in, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow him. He had no idea how far he had traveled or how much time had passed, but there was something wrong with the air, something wrong with the very ground beneath him. He reached another door at the end of the tunnel, a large wooden structure that looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. It was the kind of door you'd expect to find in a dungeon, dark and foreboding, with iron hinges that looked rusted beyond repair. But Jake wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the light on the other side, the safety, the escape from the nightmare he had been running from. With trembling hands, he pulled the door open. The hinges screamed in protest, and Jake winced at the sound, but he didn't stop. The door creaked open to reveal the exit. It was dark, but he could see the faint outline of trees, the first sign of freedom. His heart jumped in his chest, relief flooding through him. He was almost out, almost free. But as he stepped through the doorway, he froze. There, standing in the shadows just outside the door, was the phantom. Jake's blood ran cold, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The thing was right there, standing in front of him. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and Jake felt an ice-cold grip tighten around his throat. The phantom didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to paralyze him, to render him helpless in its gaze. He took a step back, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the earth itself rejecting him, holding him in place. He couldn't move. His body felt like it was frozen to the spot. The phantom took a slow, deliberate step forward, its face hidden in shadow. The air grew colder with each movement it made, and the darkness around it seemed to swallow everything it touched. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared into the black void of the phantom's eyes. It was as if the very essence of fear lived in those eyes. It was as if the phantom had consumed everything: hope, light, life, and was now coming for him. And then, in a voice like gravel scraping against stone, the phantom spoke. "You should have left when you had the chance," it said, the words echoing in Jake's mind, filling him with dread. "Now you'll never leave." Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His voice was trapped, lost in his throat. His legs refused to move. His body was frozen in terror. He had run. He had tried to escape, but now it seemed like there was nowhere left to go. The phantom took another step closer, its long, shadowy form looming over Jake. He felt the weight of its presence pressing in on him, suffocating him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything. But his body betrayed him. He couldn't move. "You don't understand," the phantom whispered, its voice a low, hissing rasp. "You thought you could find the truth, but the truth is not what you think. There is no escape from this place." Jake's mind raced. What was the phantom talking about? The truth? What did it mean by that? He had come here looking for answers, but now it seemed like the answers had led him to this moment. Trapped, caught in the web of whatever dark force had haunted Mill Creek for so long. The phantom raised a long, bony hand, and for a moment, Jake thought it was going to strike. But instead, the hand hovered in the air, and Jake felt the weight of it, as if it was pressing down on him, holding him in place. His breathing grew shallow, his chest tightening, as though he couldn't get enough air. He felt like he was being suffocated, like the phantom was taking everything from him, piece by piece. "You should have left," the phantom repeated, its voice colder now, more final. "But now it's too late." Drake's heart pounded in his chest as the phantom took its final step, closing the distance between them. He could feel the cold, the dread, the suffocating fear pressing in on him. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the phantom vanished into the darkness, leaving Jake standing alone in the cold, with only the faint sound of his own heartbeat to fill the silence. For a moment, Jake couldn't move. He was still trapped in the lingering presence of the phantom, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. But slowly, he forced himself to turn away from the spot where the phantom had stood. He had to get out. He had to leave Mill Creek. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with him. And now he was trapped in its story, just like everyone else who had come before him. Jake stumbled backward, his legs shaky, and he started running again, his heart racing with fear. But the darkness was closing in, and the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jake's body was discovered days later, just outside the woods. No one knew how or when it had happened. Some said he had simply become another victim of the phantom, the thing that had haunted Mill Creek for so long, its legend buried in the bones of the town. But others whispered that Jake had uncovered something that was never meant to be uncovered, something that had been buried in the darkest corners of the town's history, waiting to be revealed. They said Jake had seen the truth, and that was why he was taken, but no one could say for sure. The police conducted an investigation, but it led nowhere. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence that could explain how Jake had died. His body had been found lying face up, his eyes wide open, as if he had been staring at something in his final moments, something terrifying that had drained all life from him. The expression on his face was one of pure horror, but there was no visible cause for it. No blood, no wounds, just the cold, pale, lonely, dead gaze of a man who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Jake had been a stranger to Mill Creek, a journalist chasing a story, but now his name had become another part of the town's grim history. His death added to the pile of unanswered questions that had accumulated over the years, and the townspeople whispered behind closed doors, afraid that the phantom wasn't finished, that the thing in the woods would not stop until it had claimed everyone. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew quieter, as they always did. Life in Mill Creek returned to its normal rhythm, but there was an undercurrent of unease, something just beneath the surface. People kept their distance, avoiding the woods, avoiding the darkened corners of town. They no longer spoke of Jake, or the phantom, or the terror that had claimed him. They didn't have to. Everyone knew. Everyone felt it. But the real terror didn't end with Jake. No, that would have been too easy. Some nights, if you drive through Mill Creek, when the sun dips low, casting long shadows over the empty streets, if you're quiet enough, you might see something. Just a flicker at the edge of your vision, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. You might think it's a trick of the light. Just your eyes. It's the phantom, and it's always waiting. Some say the phantom only comes out at night, but that's not true. It's always there, lurking in the shadows, just beyond the trees. It's as if the woods themselves are alive, breathing with the presence of something that doesn't belong. The town of Mill Creek is cursed, and the phantom is its keeper. It's not just a murderer. It's something much worse. Something that feeds on fear, on despair. It's not bound by the rules of life and death. It can appear at any moment, in any form, as long as it can find someone to take. If you ask the old people in town, they'll tell you stories of the phantom. Stories of the people who went into the woods and never came back. They'll tell you about the old cult that once inhabited the town, the one that carved those symbols into the church walls. They'll tell you how the phantom is tied to the land itself, how it was born from the darkness of the past, and now it haunts Mill Creek, waiting for the right moment to strike. They'll tell you that the phantom isn't just a ghost or a man. It's a spirit, a force of nature, a part of the town's very soul. And it won't rest until it's taken everyone. The locals know better than to venture near the woods after dark. They know that the phantom is still out there, watching, waiting. The terror from the past has never truly gone away. It's just biding its time, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. And when they do, the phantom will make sure they never leave. It's not just a story anymore. It's not just something you hear from the old folks to scare kids. It's real. It's out there, and the town of Mill Creek is its prison. The phantom doesn't leave, not even for a moment. It's always watching, always waiting for the next person to cross its path. And no one is safe. Not even the ones who think they know the truth. Jake was just the first, but he won't be the last. If you ever find yourself near Mill Creek, be careful. Keep your eyes on the road and never stop driving once the sun starts to set. Don't look to the woods, no matter how curious you are, because if you do, you might see something you're not meant to see. And if you're not careful, you might find yourself part of the story, too. The phantom waits for its next victim, and it won't stop until it has taken them all. So, if you ever find yourself near a small town called Mill Creek, remember this. Don't go into the woods at night. Because the terror from the past, it still haunts again, and it's never going away, and neither is the phantom.